¿Cómo era la humanidad antes de que la conociésemos nosotros,
What
los
was
pobres?
humanity like 200 years ago? How do you get out of poverty?
La pobreza siempre es algo relativo, entonces no sé si las personas de otros tiempos se sentían como
Claro.
tal pobres.
Poverty is always relative, so I don't know if people in the past felt poor or understood that this was existence
La
itself.
existencia era vivir casi
The natural condition of existence was to live almost on the edge of subsistence. Anyone who reads an economic history of Europe or the world, that of Carlo Capoya, for example, or others, Clought's, for example, or Rondo
el
Cameron's,
nivel de vida
the
hasta
standard
el
of living up to
XVIII,
the
XIX,
18th to 19th century remained fairly stagnant for hundreds of years.
con mínimo, es decir, con unas condiciones
That is,
de
with
vida
minimal
muy
economic growth,
limitadas.
with living conditions very close to subsistence.
Creo recordar que Cipolla, la
I
historia que
recall that Capoya, in his The Fontana Economic History of Europe, speaks of a normal worker in the Middle Ages spending 90% of his income on food, and food was not always guaranteed, but not because there were no crops or anything like that. It may simply be due to a lack of distribution. Maybe there was food in Germany, but there wasn't any in Spain, and there was no physical way of bringing it over, or a lot of it would rot along the way. There were not the logistics we have today. A lot of the problems of food, of all sorts of things, have been overcome by many things, because of green revolutions, but also due to revolutions in logistics and transport. And this kind of thing is often given little importance. The railway, for example, did a lot. Freezer ships helped a lot to transport food and so on. So over time it became cheaper to buy food and clothing and other things. And now we can spend money on other things. And that was the condition of existence. And life in general was short. Genetically, there were people who lasted 70, 80, 90 years. But they were not, as they are today, the majority of the population. It was a small percentage. A person was the same genetically as today, or very similar to us genetically. So we are configured to last 80, 90 years. And there were people who reached 80, 90 years old, but it was a very small percentage. Unlike today, when almost half of the population reaches that age. So it was a poor situation, with a lot of diseases, with a lot of insecurity, often more bellicose than today. In other words, on a material level, it was nothing worth being repeated. In fact, I doubt very much that we would have survived in those days. We are not used to cold, rain, recurrent hunger, things like that. So I don't know if we would adapt well.
¿Cómo sale la humanidad de ese estado prácticamente animal?
How does humanity emerge from that almost animalistic state to what we are
La forma
today?
malthusiana es decir, que cuando había un pequeño incremento en el nivel de vida,
This is what is called the Malthusian trap. The Malthusian trap is that when there was a small increase in living standards due to some technical improvement, some harvest, the population would quickly increase to the point where it would cover the growth until it was balanced again. So there was no substantial improvement. That starts with capitalism. Capitalism makes it possible to break the Malthusian trap. It allows the work of a man or a woman to be multiplied by a factor of 10, 100, sometimes 1,000, simply by using capital goods, using machinery, electricity. All these technical innovations allow you to multiply your strength and produce much more than the population increases. That is where the Malthusian trap is broken. We started to have more assets as the population increased. Production grew by more than the population in the countries that adopted this system, because this system does not appear worldwide. It is not even natural. Capitalism is, and I agree with many who say this, not natural. It is an invention. It is a human invention, such as, for example, science, in the sense that science is about seeing the phenomena of nature with different eyes, with a method, with a series of techniques, and we are making progress and the achievements are advancing. This is about looking at economic phenomena with different eyes, and especially with factors such as accounting, for example, which is an essential factor, because capitalism is a mental technology which is calculation, which is saving, and systematic investment in the best possible use at any given time. And for that, we need to have accounting. For example, Werner Sombart, when he talks about the successes of capitalism, focuses a lot on accounting. That's why I say it's more a mental thing than something tangible. The tangible part is the result of that mental experiment. The same applies to advances in science or some other kind of knowledge. Writing is also a form of mental technology. It is not natural. Writing has to be learned. Science has to be learned. It is a method. Capitalism is also something you have to learn. And I think that's why it has a lot of resistance, because it's not something natural. It's not something that people understand. Deferring consumption, saving it for the sake of a future good. I think that is difficult to understand. It requires a mindset.
¿Cuándo crees que empieza el capitalismo? ¿En la revolución industrial?
And when do you think capitalism begins? In the Industrial
Creo
Revolution?
que es la Edad Media.
Desde la
Como
Edad Media.
tecnología. Empieza a hablar con Luca Pacioli.
As
con
a
los-
technology, I think it's the Middle Ages. It starts with Luca Pacioli, with the city-states of the Renaissance. That is where the theoretical foundations begin to emerge.
digamos, una sociedad.
They start to shape first in small spaces, then in larger spaces. That's how that system expands.
Sistema es como se va expandiendo. ¿no?
It is born in city-states, but capitalism as such starts in the Industrial Revolution,
Industriales, en Inglaterra y en Flandes.
in England and Flanders.
Mucha gente que critica el tema capitalismo, sobre todo en la revolución industrial.
And then there are many people who criticize capitalism, especially in the Industrial Revolution, because a lot of children were working in factories and so on.
Necesario, es que, o sea, la
Do you think that is really
Que parece
necessary?
como si dijéramos que los niños en el campo estaban jugando al golf.
Yes, but it's as if we were saying that the children were playing golf or paddle tennis. No, they also worked in the fields and they also worked very hard and with a higher mortality rate.
Pero muchas
Of course, these are undesirable circumstances, but they often have to be put in context.
en aquel momento
And I'm not saying that it's a good thing that it happened in this way. It's just that at the time, poverty and work were concentrated, it was noticeable, and it was easier to see than before when it was more dispersed and more hidden. It is not desirable, but that was a necessary process. And the debate would be whether those children lived better than before or not. I know it is a tough debate, but that is what needs to be debated. In fact, this is the only system that has managed to stop children from working.
capitalismo primero la gente
The countries of advanced capitalism are where children do not work. Capitalism, first of all, people think it emerges easily. No, it takes generations to adapt. Even Marxist historians like E.P. Thompson, whom I like,
Yo creo que un gran logro del capitalismo también
he
es
explains how this work is being
trabajador
shaped.
moderno, que es un trabajador superproductivo.
I believe that one of the achievements of capitalism is labor. It is the worker, the modern worker. He is a super productive, super serious, and super capable worker who is often not given the value he deserves. Without a serious, hard-working, well-educated workforce, there could be no capitalism either. Values have to come first. On the one hand, there has to be a kind of accounting, there has to be a technique. But on the other hand, there must also be values that lead us not to consume, but to deprive ourselves of part of our current consumption and defer it to the future. In other words, you need self-control.
Quieto. No gastes todo lo que tienes.
Don't spend everything you have, save it for tomorrow. Sacrifice an immediate pleasure for some foresight for the future. That is what is difficult to understand. That is why it is often associated with religion, which is the thesis of Weber and other authors.
Mucha polémica con eso, precisamente con las religiones. Mucha gente que dice que la religión, en concreto la
There are a
cristiana,
lot of people who say that religion, Christianity in particular, slowed down the development of nations.
Hay que ver los sitios donde no hay religión cristiana si crecieron más.
Well, you have to look at the places where there is no Christian religion and see if they grew more.
A ver, capitalismo es una tecnología que
Let's see.
no es
Capitalism is a technology that is not, obviously, not exactly derived from Christianity, although Christianity is not opposed to it,
cultura cristiana.
even if they say otherwise. The proof is that capitalism was born in countries with a Christian culture. If there was serious opposition, it would not have been born.
Y entonces lo que enseña
There must be something, at least part of Christian doctrine, that is consistent with the capitalist system. And so, what the morality of the Christian religion teaches is to repress lust, gluttony, in general consumption, present consumption. Lust in that strict sense, in the sense of luxury goods, of consuming too much.
se dice que
It is often said that capitalism is identified with consumerism. I think they are antithetical. A consumerist people could not have drifted into capitalism, because I would not have saved to generate enough capital to buy machines, to build dams, to build railways, to build all kinds of goods, because that needs prior investment, prior savings in order to be able to finance these kinds of things. A population that spends too much would not be able to.
Sombart, una vez más repito, en el burgués. que habla-
Sombart, I repeat, in The Bourgeois, who talks a lot about these things.
los
I also distinguish between trade, free trade, and capitalism, which are different things. They are related, but they are not the same. The Chinese, for example, were trading peoples. They were a fantastic trading people. The Arabs were a fantastic trading people. They were fantastic traders in Greece, in Rome. When the old traders made a good amount of money, they retired. They would buy a villa, retire there, try to marry off their children to nobles, and so on. But they didn't reinvest systematically. The capitalist reinvests until almost before he dies. He doesn't want to retire. He always has that logic, and it is a change of logic. But that is what changed, because trade is one thing and capitalism is another.
¿Tú crees que los jóvenes viven peor que antes? Porque parece, tú te metes en Twitter y parece que...
And do you think that the young people who live now live worse than before? Because you go on Twitter and it seems that we young people now live badly.
Ahora, claro, ya, pues no era fácil tampoco. No sé ahora cómo se sienten, repito.
I don't know, because being young was never easy. Before, it wasn't easy either. I don't know how they feel now, but I see that they now have a number of advantages that we did not have. These things about them traveling, knowing more languages than us. I see them on Erasmus and they are out and about. Their ability to travel and move. They have smartphones. I didn't know about them in my time. I mean, you can listen to all the music in the world. You don't know what that is because you were born with it. It wasn't like that before. When I wanted something, I couldn't look it up on Spotify and download it. It would cost a fortune, or sometimes there wasn't any at all. And now, just the other day, they sent me something from a Mongolian group. It was a Mongolian rock band, they sent me that. It was unthinkable before that I would have access to a Mongolian rock group and could watch the video. And to be able to see them live and things like that. It was just unthinkable. Or you have an entire library of millions of books on your mobile phone. When I was like you, getting some books was very complicated. Whether they are better off or worse off, I don't know.
¿Está mejor o peor? No lo sé. Yo creo que, por ejemplo, para la vivienda tienen problemas, etc.
I think that, for example, they have problems with housing and so on. I sense a certain hopelessness, which maybe we didn't have. I see that they are more hopeless, but I don't know. I suppose there will be all sorts of things, and there will be people who are very optimistic, others who are not, and so on. But I see a lot of them like that. That's normal for all generations. Some things they have are better, but other things they have, I think, are worse.
Yo quiero hacer hincapié en los valores también, porque...
I would also like to emphasize values, because I believe that in these new generations, perhaps the values that were once held are being lost.
Daniel Bell y de otros sociólogos.
But this is an old thesis. That comes from Daniel Bell and other sociologists. Capitalism, with its triumph, destroys the values that engendered it. Because capitalism was born in times of hardness, of very hard people, of pioneers, people who went there to work in the mines. All people who work in conditions, as you have just pointed out, that were very tough. So these people sacrificed. They were thrifty. They looked to the future. They didn't have much of a propensity to spend on vices and things like that, and thought about the longer term. They were also often associated with religious values. Religious values, in that respect, tend to help with long-term thinking. That kind of combination generated a class that saved and built all this. The problem Bell says is that modern youth have no memory of the past. They have no memory of misery. They have never seen it, at least not in their immediate environment. Misery, not relative poverty. Real misery. No food to eat, people going barefoot, many people like that, living in absolute destitution, lack of food and so on. There is no memory of that. So we think that, this is a little joke of mine, we think that Madrid used to be like today, but with 3G. People think it used to be like it is now, but with slower internet. There was no internet. There was none of this. But because you were born with this, and it is the normal thing, because it is how you have lived all your life, your whole life is this, you always had these things, so there is no memory of this. And they think that this is like something that has fallen from the sky, and that it can't end, that we can spend, and that it has always been like this, and that this can never end, that we cannot end up poor. Because one thing I emphasize and I always ask is, which is easier, to be poor or to be rich? Being poor is so easy. You just stay in bed and don't get up for 2 months. You end up poor for sure. It is easy. With certain behaviors not working and so on. This is not to say that the poor deserve to be poor, nor that it is their fault that they are poor. What I'm saying is that if you want to be poor, it is easier for you to be poor than to be rich. Because being rich does require a more positive activity. except in some cases. You will have to produce things that others like. You will have to earn money. You will have to get up. In any case, you will have to decide where to invest your money. It is an active action, and one that requires care, because it is as difficult to create a fortune as it is to maintain it. Assets have to be depreciated, and you have to be continuously renewing their use, changing the investments. You have to stay on top of them. Otherwise, everything is wasted. So that's what I think is important in that regard. It is easy to be poor, and the descent into poverty tends to be faster than the rise to wealth. It is easier to fall into poverty in a short time than to become rich. Becoming rich takes considerably more years on average. Maybe if you win a lottery or an inheritance, something like that. But with your work or investments, it is more difficult to become rich. Being poor is relatively easy. We can see it in Latin American countries. When I was young, they were richer than Spain, believe it or not. In fact, people migrated from here to there. Galicians and people from all over Spain and Asturians migrated there.
¿Cree que la riqueza viene más sobre los valores que hay en la
Do you think
sociedad?
that wealth is more about the values that exist in society or about how that society is governed politically?
Tolera, digamos, o más bien que deja a la gente.
If the government tolerates, or rather lets people do things, I don't think you can force anyone to be rich by decree if they don't want to be. Nor is it compulsory to have a level of development. Now, if you don't want to have that development, you will have to bear the consequences of not having it. In order to have a developed economy, it requires a certain sacrifice by the population. Indeed, you have to work every day, you have to lead a sober life, you have to carry a number of drawbacks. In return, hunger is eliminated, you are more or less medically cared for, you have housing, you may even have a car or smartphones. That is not free. It also requires a sacrifice on the part of the population, a sacrifice many see as unnecessary, and so on. But many times you have to do it. You have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, you have to work, you have to do things that are useful for others, and so on. That is the point.
Y ahora que hablamos de la riqueza de las naciones, sobre todo en Latinoamérica,
And now that we are talking about the wealth of nations, particularly in Latin America, what do you think about Javier Milei? Do you believe that good policies can really lead to Argentina's success?
A ver, primero que el triunfo, eso lleva tiempo también.
First, that triumph, that takes time too. If the policies that have been pursued so far are not changed, Argentina will continue more or less along the same lines as before, with hyperinflation, with notable economic deterioration, with big cycles, and I believe that at some point this process will have to be reversed. I honestly believe that the measures taken by Milei, some of them are more debatable than others, but I think they are along the right lines. Another matter is whether he is allowed to carry out his program, whether he can get it through Congress or the Senate, that there is no resistance, but I believe that at least the ideas are there, and that it opens up a new debate as well. There is another way of understanding public policy, a different one. At least there is a debate. It opens up a debate, it will be right or wrong, but it can be discussed. But at least it opens up a discussion that has not existed so far.
Javier Milei hace poco dijo que si le iba bien a su país,
Javier Milei recently said that if his country did well, it was not only a triumph for Argentina, it was a world
Lo
triumph.
dije, el capitalismo nace en nosotros muy pequeños. El capitalismo no nace a nivel mundial. El
Yes,
capitalismo
as I said before, capitalism is born in very small places, and they start to make progress and others follow suit. Because human beings are imitative beings, they imitate what works well. So other countries are copying this model and imitating it, and it is developing, extending capitalism, sometimes by bloody means, which I do not advocate, but sometimes through imitation in other countries of the world. This is the same thing. If Argentina did well and the results were good, I am sure many countries would follow suit, precisely because it is the easiest thing to do. Gabriel Tarde wrote that book on the laws of imitation. Human beings like to imitate a lot. It is logical. If something works well, he copies it. If it works badly, he doesn't copy it. That is why I like the fact that there is a plurality of governments and states in the world, because then they can copy from each other. If Argentina does well, I am sure that many countries in the world with similar problems will copy it.
¿qué consejos nos podrías dar a nosotros los jóvenes para prosperar un país?
What advice could you give us young people to build a prosperous country? Individually, of course, but how can a country prosper collectively?
Yo no, a ver, no quiero dar consejos, repito, porque mi generación.
I don't want to give advice because although we criticize young people a lot, my generation I think is worse. It did more damage than yours. Because we come from 1968 and we brought a lot of strange ideas ourselves. I'm not the most suitable one, maybe, to advise anyone on this kind of thing. I think young people know how to do things well. But in this case, you should imitate the values of grandparents. I know it's a cliche, to lead a humble, hard-working life, not expecting big changes, because people seem to want it now. But wait patiently in time, and think a little bit in the long term. But be a bit self-sacrificing. Maybe because of the way I am, as a Christian, I understand that we come into the world to suffer. This is a vale of tears. So, my perspective of the world is that this is a vale of tears. And every now and then something good happens to you. You enjoy it twice as much. Another view is, on the other hand, that everything is wonderful. Then, when you get frustrated, that's when you have a bad time. But I start from a less optimistic point of view. I am here, the world is not an easy thing. We don't come here to have a good time. Because normally, if you go with that perspective, I think you often don't have a good time. Suddenly, something happens to you, a joy, one little thing. It's when you have a good time. We come here, we suffer, we work, and then the good things come out of it. I mean, we have to get up at 6 o'clock, we have to work, but a lot of good things are going to come from that. But I would start from that point of view. I know it's counterintuitive. I know it is not what is being advocated today, that the opposite is being advocated. But that's the way it is.